Roy DeMeo and Nino Gaggi would sort of oversee at least Neil Delacroce. They were being used sort of as the eyes and ears for Paul Castellano to keep an eye on Delacroce, and especially the Brooklyn faction of the Gambino crime family, because and listen, I can't say this for certain, but I think that Paul Castellano might have had some trepidations about Neil Delacroce that obviously went back to the Albert Anastasia stuff. And I think that putting Nino in charge of sort of keeping a close eye on him, it probably certifies that there was some uneasiness between Paul Castellano and Neil Delacroce, and for good reason. Last week, we also mentioned that the move of Castellano moving Delacroce into the underboss position essentially split the family into almost rival factions. And what I mean by that is Delacroce had his mindset. He believed in the core values of the Mafia, but I don't think that he ever forgot what Carlo Gambino did to Albert Anastasia. And so we can play, the guessing game all day long as far as that goes. But I think that it had a lot to do with Castellano and the spillover from Carlo in the past, if you want to call it that. So in 1978, shortly after Paul Castellano takes control of the family, he brokers a deal between the Gambinos and the Westies. At the time, the Westies, were then pretty much under control of Jimmy Coonan, but we have to understand that we have to sort of understand how Jimmy Coonan came to, because here's the thing. I don't want to do a biography. We started this brand new platform with the DeMeo crew, and we've talked about the Westies over on YouTube. So I don't want to do a log line and a biography of them, but we sort of have to understand how this came to be. We have to make sense of why the Gambinos would have brokered a deal with the Westies to begin with. And the reason for that is Mickey Spiillane, who had run the Westies for years, began to have problems with the Genovese Crime Family as Tony Salerno wanted a cut of the Javits Center. And that presented Salerno and the Genovese Crime Family with lucrative construction rackets, union jobs in concrete, and labor union money. Salerno had approached Spillane about it, and Spillane more or less told Salerno that Hell's Kitchen was his and it belonged to the Irish and he can go get fucked. Salerno wasn't happy about it, and he ends up approaching Jimmy Coonan because he knew that Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Spiillane had a beef. Coonan had a beef that went way back for years because Spillane had pretty much pistol whipped the shit out of his father, John, who was not a street guy. He was just a simple accountant, and Spillane was throwing his weight around. And Coonan always hated Mickey Spiillane for that sort of thing. And Coonan deep inside had, sort of designs on wanting to take over the Westies. Coonan in the past had even tried encroaching onto Spillane's territory, but was relatively unsuccessful in doing that. And that was back in the 60s. And then he ended up doing a 10-year bid in prison, which is why he couldn't continue to sort of go after those rackets. One of the things that the Italians wanted was to keep full control of the construction rackets in Hell's Kitchen. With Spillane refusing, Tony Salerno ends up saying, okay, well, we got to deal with this. And what Salerno does is he barters with Jimmy Coonan. If Salerno takes Spillane out, would Jimmy Coonan be willing to split part of the Javits Center with the Genovese Crime Family? Coonan says, yeah, not a problem. So Salerno ends up contracting Mad Dog Sullivan to kill Mickey Spiillane. Sullivan would end up actually killing Tom Devaney, Eddie Comiskey, and Tom Capitos, who at the time were three of Spillane's toughest guys. Spillane then, after being threatened that his kids would be killed, takes his family and moves them to Woodside, Queens for safety reasons. And he still sort of attempts to control what was left of the Westies. But unfortunately, it was pretty much over at that point. Then at May 13th of 1977, Mickey Spiillane, who was only 43 at the time, was killed outside of his apartment in Queens. That murder was subcontracted to Roy DeMeo as a favor to Castellano on behalf of Tony Salerno. And so the Genovese and Gambinos would end up splitting whatever profits, and Jimmy Coonan would get a nice little kickback as a result of all of that. So Salerno gets what he wants, Paul Castellano gets what he wants, and Jimmy Coonan gets what he wants. And so we have to jump back just a little bit to 1978, because prior to the Westies, Jimmy Coonan was a bodyguard for a hitman for Ruby Stein. Ruby Stein was one of the biggest loan sharks in the city, one of the biggest loan sharks in the history of the Mafia, especially for a guy who wasn't Italian. Stein also had gambling dens all over the city. Once Coonan took over the Westies, he sort of moves on Ruby Stein. And basically the reason why he does is he wants his fucking money and he wants his ledger. His ledger contained all the names, all the amounts people owed. And it's been alleged that he had $1 million on the street. And now listen, that's a ballsy guy. That's a ballsy move for a guy who at the time, Ruby Stein was protected big time. And it's a ballsy move for Coonan to do. So what Coonan did was he lures Stein to the 596 Club. And that club was owned by somebody a member of the Westies. And Stein really had nothing to fear. And what ends up happening is he walks in and he shortly is shot to death. They end up dismembering him. They put his body parts into bags and they dump it in the Hudson River. The mistake that Jimmy Coonan makes is he doesn't puncture the lungs, and Stein's body ends up floating to the top of the river and ends up being found and identified. The main goal, like I said at the beginning, was to acquire Stein's black book with over $1 million on the streets. It was something that Coonan, could leverage against the other 5 families in case they wanted to come after him, and 2, he wanted the fucking money. And what Coonan was risking by doing that was that the Colombos and the Genovese might retaliate against Jimmy Coonan for doing that, because you got to remember Ruby Stein was paying a kickback to the families in the territories that he was operating, so they were getting a street tax off all of that. And so what ends up happening is, as a result of killing him, a lot of people were upset, but Jimmy Coonan does the right thing. He makes sure he gets the book, because one of the things that Jimmy Coonan always wanted to be was an Italian gangster. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But it's been said, at least from a street perspective, that the Gambinos and the Genovese crime family marveled at the fact that Jimmy Coonan had balls. And they would see that in him, and then they would use that to their advantage. Now, how Castellano and the Westies came to be really goes back to Roy DeMeo. He had dealings on and off with Jimmy Coonan throughout the years, porn and stuff like that, with the construction deals that were in place. And with Coonan, for the most part, a little bit too wild for the Gambinos, Castellano starts to think maybe it's a good idea if we bring these guys in and sort of put a cap on what they're trying to do. And so what Castellano does is he requests a meeting with Coonan through Roy DeMeo. A meeting gets set. The meeting was very basic in its structure. Castellano knew that not only could he make money off of the Westies, but he wanted more control in Manhattan, especially in the Hell's Kitchen area. He worried that Jimmy Coonan killing people just on a whim would present problems for the Mafia in general, sort of like Lucky Luciano saw things back in the day. And if he could find a way to broker some sort of deal that would benefit everybody, he was going to do it. And he also knew that Jimmy Coonan wanted to be respected. He wanted to be accepted by the Italians. Later on down the line, before Mickey Featherstone becomes a rat, they would accuse Jimmy Coonan of wanting to be Italian more than being Irish. So the meeting takes place. Castellano offers Coonan a deal. And the deal was basically this. They control Hell's Kitchen. Do whatever you want. We want 10% of your rackets. We will allow you to operate numbers, prostitution, narcotics, whatever you want to do for that 10%. And in return, you can use our name for protection from the other 5 families. And that they would use them as a murder for hire crew. Look at Murder Inc. Basically look at it like that. While most guys would have just simply probably said no to something like that, that appealed to Jimmy Coonan's sensibility. And one of the things that Jimmy Coonan was told was, listen, you can murder, but you cannot murder anybody within your own family or within our own family or anybody on the streets without the permission of the Gambino crime family. Your direct contact for all of that would be through Roy DeMeo. Jimmy Coonan agrees. But ultimately, as we know historically, it came back to bite Paul Castellano in the ass big time, because Coonan would, within a year and a half or 2 years, absolutely go batshit crazy and starts killing everybody like Roy DeMeo did. For Castellano, the deal makes sense. We control their action. We get a kickback. They whack whoever gets in the way, which will take our own men out of the equation, which means we will not get indicted in some sort of murder conspiracy. And he liked the Irish kids. But don't be fooled. Really, at the end of the day, the ends justified the means, and it was just a way to get more money, and it was a way to use them to get what he wanted. Because believe me, at the end of the day, Paul Castellano could have pushed a button, and every single one of them fucking Westies would have been killed. On Coonan's part, he goes back, he tells his guys what the deal is with the Gambino crime family, and they weren't too happy with him. They wanted nothing to do with the Italians, and they felt that Jimmy was kissing their ass and wanted to be Italian. Others inside the Westies felt that Spillane, had pretty much stood his ground against the Italians for as long as he could, and he lasted a long time, and that they should have done the same exact thing. But Coonan would explain that this protected them from the other 5 families, and ultimately that would lead to Coonan having issues within his own crime family, which would start a killing spree not a couple years later. Also, in late 1978, Paul Castellano would create a deeper alliance with the Cherry Hill Gambinos. Now, the Cherry Hill Gambinos were already there in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. They were selling narcotics. They were all Sicilian, but he more or less added them as a secondary hit squad. So, meanwhile, they're selling drugs. He says, well, you're selling drugs, but I also want you guys to kill for me. And so it wasn't just a narcotics operation now, but now they're going to be used as contracted killers. So you combine that with the Westies, Roy DeMeo, Castellano had an entire wing of willing fucking killers. However, I don't think that Castellano suspected that Roy DeMeo would end up going on his fucking murder spree, which would end up causing nothing but fucking headaches for Castellano and the Gambino crime family. So in 1980, Paul Castellano would end up having his own son, Frank Amato, killed and dismembered. Amato, who was a street guy, sort of on an associate level, was actually married to Paul's daughter by the name of Constance. She went by Connie. Word had traveled back to Castellano that Amato was essentially bad-mouthing him behind his back. And while most guys probably would have just gotten a simple beating for that, what happened next sort of assured that Amato was going to suffer. Castellano, as it was told to me by somebody who knew them very well, that for 2 weeks or so, Paul Castellano had been trying to get a hold of his daughter, and it was always, oh, I'm sick, it's this, it's that, I'm busy doing this and that. And finally, Paul starts to get worried, so he sends Tommy Bilotti over. He tells him, bring her to my house. And pretty much Tommy Bilotti goes there, gets her. He brings her back to the house, and Castellano really sees her for the first time in a couple weeks, and she's wearing sunglasses. Take off your glasses. She refuses. He gets pissed off. He tears the sunglasses off her face, and her eyes were so bruised and blackened, and they were almost swollen shut. Castellano asked her if her husband had done that to her, and at first she says no. Then after prodding, she admits that she was being physically beaten by Amato. Castellano would send her home, and he would tell Bilotti to bring Nino Gaggi to him. Paul would meet with Nino and tell him that Amato needed to go, and he didn't need to be handled nicely. Nino would contract the murder to Roy DeMeo. DeMeo would kidnap Amato. He tortured him for several days before dismembering him while he was still alive. Now, if that's not fucking justice for putting your hands on a woman, I don't know what is. His body parts are loaded into bags, put on a boat. Boat goes out to sea. Body parts go into the ocean. In 1981, Paul Castellano gets word from chicken magnate Frank Perdue that he wanted to have a meeting. Obviously, Perdue Chicken, everybody should know who that is. Castellano, sort of being a wannabe Fortune 500 company owner himself, ends up taking the meeting. They end up meeting together, and Perdue explains to him that there's a situation, and he sort of needs Castellano's help. And at the time, Purdue's, and it still is, the Perdue base of operations was located in Virginia. Virginia, other than certain industries like the Longshoremen's Union, are non-union jobs. They don't allow a lot of union jobs in Virginia. It's the way it's always been. At the Perdue facility, there was a lot of talk amongst the workers and outside sources that Perdue workers were going to try to unionize. It was a problem for Perdue, not just because it would mean possible work stoppages, but it meant higher wages, less hours, and it meant problems for Perdue in the long run. And what Perdue really wanted from Paul Castellano And the reason why is because the Gambinos had long controlled the ports in Virginia. They controlled the unions, specifically the docks. Would Castellano help? Could he help? Is there any way he could do it? Castellano, according to somebody that I talked to, who told me that basically Castellano agreed to help him in whatever way he could. However, he wanted to extend his food companies into Virginia as a subsidiary underneath the Purdue. The men agreed, they shook hands, and Purdue never, ever had a union fucking problem. Purdue was asked years later by the FBI about his involvement with Castellano, and he explains that they met once, and that was the extent of it. And so Castellano was trying to help somebody that he admired, and I get it. Paul was a business guy. He admired people that were very successful at business. That was more his speed versus guys on the corner. And it helped line his pockets as well. So it gave him the ability to sort of shield himself as sort of a business conglomerate rather than a gangster. When guys on the streets sort of begin to see that Paul Castellano, he takes over Whole Foods, he's got Canadian Food Corporations, he has his Blue Ribbon Butchering and Meat Company, he's got restaurant supply companies, he's got his construction company, and then word starts to travel that he's meeting with Frank Purdue. They sort of begin to just sort of talk about him wanting to be a business guy more than a gangster, and that's where that comes from. Street guys didn't want Frank Purdue as a fucking boss. They wanted a straight gangster. It just left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, albeit jealousy or whatever the case may have been. I think they just saw this as a move that a boss of the biggest and most powerful crime family in America should not be fucking doing under any circumstances. And it also didn't help, that Paul was asking for a higher percentage of kick up from his captains and his associates down to the soldiers and etc. And those are the things that effectively lay the seeds for discontent down the line, especially from the Brooklyn faction of the Gambino crime family, which we know involved John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, and a bunch of other people. So with DeMeo, the problems sort of begin. Roy DeMeo, who we've talked, obviously, and I said this earlier, we've talked extensively about on this show. You can go to YouTube and listen to that, or you can go to the first show that we did on this new platform, the DeMeo crew. We sort of talk about everything he's done. And I don't, for the life of me, want to rehash his entire life here, but there's a couple of things we have to talk about just so that we understand the direction it's going. So in late 1977, as a result of sort of brokering the Gambino crime family and the Westies together, Roy DeMeo ends up getting inducted into the Gambino crime family. Castellano did not want to induct Roy DeMeo. A lot of it is because of the things he heard, that DeMeo was fond of murder, and that's something that Castellano didn't really feel like that was a great attribute to have in the family. Killing was meant to be an absolute resolution to a business problem, but it shouldn't be a fucking hobby. And DeMeo, as we know, enjoyed doing that shit. But for whatever reason, Paul allows him to be inducted, and basically Roy gets put in charge of overseeing the Westies, and he was told, you are going to be held accountable for any of the actions the Westies take without permission of me. And one of the issues was that Paul Castellano didn't want anybody in his family selling drugs. He had his crew in New Jersey, and that was enough for him. Paul didn't ask where the money came from. Large sums of money that came to Paul Castellano was from narcotics, but he just didn't want to know. If he found out certifiably that you were selling drugs, you would be killed. A lot of people get confused sort of about that edict. They would take the money. They had no compunction about anybody selling drugs, but they just didn't want to know, and they didn't want to get indicted for it, and that's the reason why they said no. Now, later on, Paul would change the rule, and he would end up saying anybody that wasn't inducted after 1962 couldn't sell drugs. So once again, we see the hypocrisy here with Paul Castellano saying, you can't sell drugs, you can't sell drugs. But you know what? If you were inducted, prior to 1962, it's okay. So you see the hypocrisy going back and forth. And I guess that's a way of saying in the old days, this is what they did. So anybody that's that old gets a special condition. Now, can you see why that would piss somebody off? You're going to tell me that a guy that was inducted before 1962 can sell drugs and I can't? So you could see where some of the discontent was going to start. And so, it's just a simple thing to understand. If you got indicted for drugs, you were going to get killed. It's just that simple. And Castellano didn't ever want to get indicted for narcotics because that was a life sentence out of the gate. Now, ultimately, we know Paul Castellano gets indicted for drugs twice, which we will talk a little bit about today. So DeMeo, was a good steward to the family, right? He does what he's supposed to do. He was an incredible earner by all accounts. This guy, could make a ton of money, but he's pushing narcotics. The DeMeo crew, which included Anthony Center, Dominic Montiglio, Joey Testa, Henry Borelli, Chris Rosenberg, Patrick Testa, Richie and Freddie Denome, Joseph Dracula Guglielmo, Vito Arena, and Carlo Profeta were in that group, which Roy DeMeo oversaw. And who oversaw Roy DeMeo? Nino Gaggi, who turned a blind eye to an awful lot of shit. DeMeo was a hell of a businessman. He controlled the pornography. He was into bestiality too. I don't really want to talk about that, but loan sharking. He controlled the bank, and he would make loans through Friends Corporations through that bank. Then he would turn and burn that bank when people got wise. DeMeo was truly a one-stop shop for rackets. He ends up meeting Richard Kuklinski through an associate, and a lot of people talk about Richard Kuklinski. He was a serial killer. He was never a mobster, never a mob contracted hitman. None of that is fucking true. The only inference that Richard Kuklinski has with the Gambino crime family is when Roy DeMeo basically pistol whipped him and beat the shit out of him, forcing Kuklinski to go into business with him. And that business was the fact that Kuklinski was basically bootlegging porn from a film lab. And basically Roy DeMeo just took it over. That is the only inference of Richard Kuklinski. So while DeMeo has a ton of these rackets, he's also hijacking trucks out of Kennedy. And one of the main sources out of John F. Kennedy was John Gotti Sr. John Gotti Sr. was working out of Kennedy. He was helping with trucks and etc. So DeMeo begins to move into more narcotics, and then he begins to move into auto thefts. But we're going to get into that probably more next week than this week's. One of the problems that would come back to haunt Paul Castellano almost from the inset was that Roy DeMeo went from killing people that were sanctioned to just unsanctioned murders. And he would become essentially a serial killer, and all of those murders would come back to haunt Paul Castellano. But in the interim, DeMeo was overseeing a large narcotics operation. Chris Rosenberg, who called himself Chris DeMeo, gets himself and the Gambino crime family in some very, very deep shit. So in 1979, Chris Rosenberg had brokered a deal for cocaine through a loan shark customer of Roy DeMeo's. This customer knew Colombian cartel members and assured Chris that he could get a better quality product. If everything went smoothly, this would be something that could continue monthly. It also helped that the customer of Roy's was in deep debt to Roy, and so he was sort of doing them a favor by, Roy was sort of backing off on collecting the money that he owed as long as he just sort of got this meeting together. So, what ends up, the guy's name that Chris Rosenberg ended up meeting with was Charles Padnick. Padnick would then put Rosenberg sort of in check with William Serrano. Serrano was the contact between the Colombian cartels and Padnick and Rosenberg. Padnick would end up setting a meeting up between Serrano's contacts. So a few days later, Padnick and Serrano, along with a cousin and a girlfriend of the Colombian cartel representatives, they fly to New York. Within hours of landing, they're murdered and dismembered. Their bodies were then tossed into the Fountain Avenue dump, which was owned by crew member Anthony Center's uncle. And basically, Rosenberg had pretty much stolen the cocaine and didn't give up any money. When the cartel never received word of a safe transaction, they end up calling Padnick's son Jamie. His son hops a flight to New York, and shortly after he gets here asking around what's going on, he suddenly disappears. Turns out he was shot, killed, and dismembered as well. The only information that the cartel had, the only thing that got back to them, was that the person that they believed their people were meeting was Chris DeMeo, which Chris Rosenberg used that name to sort of protect himself from other people. The Colombians end up making calls, and that name leads them to Roy DeMeo. And so they go through different channels, and the Colombians demand that the Gambinos kill Chris Rosenberg. Otherwise, they were coming to New York and there would be a problem. They wanted Chris Rosenberg killed, and they wanted it to be the headline on the newspapers because that way it was proven that they actually killed them. They didn't trust the Italians. I cannot imagine that Nino Gaggi did not tell Paul Castellano what was going on. I'm sure Paul had to know something. There's no way he couldn't have. But at that point, the demand is made on Nino Gaggi, probably on behalf of Paul. I would imagine that's going to be the case, that Chris Rosenberg has to be killed. There's no other way around it. This is the only thing that's going to stop the problem. Why that didn't get Roy DeMeo killed, I'm never going to understand that. In any event, Roy was told to get rid of Rosenberg immediately, and for weeks and weeks and weeks, Roy does nothing. And that not only pissed off Paul Castellano, but it terrified the Gambino crime family, and it also infuriated the Colombians who wanted action. So for weeks and weeks, and like I said, weeks go by, not hearing anything and not seeing anything in the newspaper, the Colombians sent a hit team to New York City, who then approached upper echelon Gambinos through middlemen and told them, unless you do something now or very soon, they are going to come here and they're going to begin shooting and killing members of the Gambino crime family, without a doubt. So while DeMeo is trying to sort out all this nonsense, a poor vacuum cleaner salesman ends up knocking, or at least parking outside of Roy's house, and he's getting ready to walk up the front steps. Roy was already petrified about Colombians sending a hit squad to kill him. And so when this guy starts to go to the door, the guy's name was Dominic Ragucci, Roy grabs a gun and starts going after him and firing, thinking that it's a hit squad from Colombia. This kid was 19 years old. He was just trying to earn money for college books by selling vacuum cleaners. Kid gets in the car, takes off. Roy gets in the car with Dracula Guglielmo, and they end up chasing the kid for miles and miles on the interstate and eventually ending up in Brooklyn. And they're firing out the fucking windows like the Wild Wild West. Ultimately, they end up shooting the kid, killing him. The kid crashes, and this kid was guilty of nothing. That should have gotten Roy DeMeo killed. For some reason, Paul Castellano does nothing, and I don't understand it. And then Nino says to Roy after this fucking debacle, you need to kill Chris or you're gone. No more games. May 11th of 1979, Chris Rosenberg, who apparently, by all accounts, was unaware of the static. I find that hard to believe, that he didn't know what was going on. But from what everybody has said, he wasn't acutely aware that there was a massive fucking problem. And he ends up walking in the Gemini Lounge. He walks in, he sits down, and they begin to discuss business. Roy DeMeo gets handed a paper bag, which I would assume that Chris Rosenberg probably thought was money, and it's not. It's a .45 caliber handgun. Roy pulls out of the bag and shoots Chris Rosenberg right in the fucking head. Doesn't kill him. He kind of stumbles to his knees and kind of looks at everybody. Then Anthony Center pulls out a burner and shoots him 4 fucking times. At point blank range, killing him. And the one thing that the cartel wanted was they wanted this to be on the front news of the newspaper, but Roy did not have the heart to kill him with a machine gun. So what they did was they took a car, they used a machine gun, they lit the fucking car up, they threw Rosenberg's body in and they parked it, and that was enough to end the possible retribution for what Rosenberg did. I wonder why, even thinking about this now, I wonder why Castellano put up with that. Was he afraid of Roy? I just don't understand, because that's that is going to bring so much fucking heat. He kills a civilian. That should have gotten him killed. But look at all of the problems you have because of somebody in his crew. People talk all the time. And if we move forward, and I don't want to get into this now, but if you move forward, right, and we're talking about John Gotti and what Angelo Ruggiero did. They were going to hold Gotti accountable for Angelo Ruggiero selling drugs, which ultimately would get Paul Castellano indicted. But at the same time, why aren't you going to hold Nino Gaggi responsible for what Roy did? Why aren't you going to hold Roy responsible for something one of his crew members did? That is the one thing that I will never understand. It wasn't just DeMeo and his reckless shit. But soon it would be, the cars to Kuwait, which we'll talk about next week, and all the unsanctioned murders. And that all drags Paul Castellano into the thick of shit. But at the same time that this was all going on, Castellano was already fucked and he didn't even know it. Because Angelo Ruggiero had a big fucking mouth. Can you imagine all of this shit taking place? Everything that we've talked about up until this point. They had DeMeo and his bullshit, killing a fucking kid that had nothing to do with nothing, the shit with the Colombians, the shit with the drugs, the stream of mistrust with Neil Delacroce, the Brooklyn faction who's really grumpy and not happy. You're seeing, Paul Castellano in a light that wasn't flattering. Pushing that further, Nino Gaggi losing control of fucking Roy DeMeo. And the Westies soon after all of this would start going apeshit and start shooting everybody. When you put all of those on a platter, and you add Angelo Ruggiero to that, I cannot imagine for one fucking second how the fuck Paul Castellano didn't die of a fucking brain aneurysm. He just didn't walk into a crime family with no fucking problems. So Angelo Ruggiero, by all accounts, and there's quite listen, I know people that knew Angelo very well, so he was a great guy, a loving guy. They looked at him like an uncle. Angelo Ruggiero had a big fucking mouth. I don't think there's any, and that's, people can have big mouths and want to be chatty Cathy and gossip and shit like that. But at the end of the day, you can't do stuff like that. Obviously Angelo Ruggiero was he came from a good family. His father wasn't in the Mafia. His father came from Naples and he got into organized crime with John Gotti. They grew up together. They were in the Fulton Rockaway Boys together. Neil Delacroce was Angelo's uncle. So while a lot of other mob people that we talk about have deep roots into the Mafia, Angelo Ruggiero didn't. Like I told you, his father was a hardworking guy from Naples. Angelo, like many others, he bounced around, was a part of the same gangs as Gotti. They were best friends. Angelo was a burly guy with a big mouth. He liked to talk. Ruggiero, wherever John Gotti was, Angelo Ruggiero was. That's just how it went. They were the best of friends. He was with John Gotti and Ralph Gallione in 1973 when Jimmy McBratney gets shot to death in Snoop's bar on orders of Carlo Gambino. And in case you don't know about that hit, Jimmy McBratney was an Irish guy. He was known for kidnapping mob guys and holding them from ransom. He had been doing it for a long time. Carlo Gambino's nephew, Manny Gambino, ends up disappearing, and it was largely suspected that McBratney was involved. That was sort of his modus operandi. And so when Carlo Gambino finds out, they pay the fucking money. But then they find out that Manny Gambino was killed months prior. So Gambino's pissed, and they want to kill McBratney. And Gotti is handed the task of handling the murder on behalf of Carlo Gambino. One of the more interesting things that nobody ever mentions is that Robert Center, who was in the Gambino crime family, who was the uncle of Anthony Center, he was involved in the murder of Manny Gambino. He was involved in that. He is the one that helped orchestrate it. They knew about it and did nothing, and I don't understand that for the life of me. That murder, so why they never took retribution against Anthony Center or his uncle, well, not Anthony, but his uncle for that, I don't get it either, because they should have killed everybody, but they end up going in Snoop's bar and Ralph Gallione shoots and kills Jimmy McBratney. And as a result, Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti end up going to prison for that, but that gets them their button. So Angelo's brother, Salvatore, he was not a mob guy. I think you could say he was an associate, but not an on-record associate. And he was a huge narcotics trafficker, so much so that most of the 1970s, he was a fugitive on the run. The no selling drugs rule did not apply to him because he wasn't a made guy. So he could do whatever he wanted. While Angelo was known for his mouth and his talkative ways, this would be another part of the wheel that not only would get Paul indicted, but would also get Paul Castellano killed in the end. May 6th of 1982, a Learjet would leave Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. On board were Salvatore Ruggiero, his wife Stephanie, Alfred Dallentash, George Morton, and some pilots. The plane was scheduled to fly from Florida from Teterboro Airport. At some point 12 miles off the coast of Georgia, the plane would plummet into the ocean. According to the black box records, the last known communication between the pilots and air traffic control was that the pilots were going to descend to 39,000 feet, which is the trajectory that you would take if you're going to land in Orlando. Just, it is what it is. 2 minutes after that communication, the response again is, are you going to descend to 39,000 feet? Yes, yes, yes. But in the background, they hear an alarm, and that alarm was known to air traffic control to be a rapid descent acceleration, meaning that they're fucking plummeting to the fucking ground, or they're plummeting to the fucking ground way too quick. They quickly radioed the plane to confirm what was going on, to relay another set of instructions, and they never hear another sound. Hours later, the Coast Guard and other boats were patrolling the area. They found pretty much no wreckage, but they found some other grisly things. A headless man's body was floating in the ocean. A half torso of another man was floating. They found a lower jaw floating that had some teeth attached. It would take 4 days for the investigation and some 24 divers, but eventually they would find the wreckage. As they searched whatever was left of humans that they could find, whatever they did find had already been ingested by the sharks, by crabs, and by fish. They were only able to find a foot with a shoe still intact. 2 hands were found. One of those hands bore an engagement ring that was later identified, or a wedding ring that was identified to be Stephanie Ruggiero. The other hand was that of Salvatore Ruggiero. Still to this day, nobody knows what the hell happened to that fucking plane. So as Angelo Ruggiero finds out that his brother's dead, he's grieving the loss of his brother, but immediately he starts thinking business, right? And he starts worrying about a bunch of things. He worried that the FBI would be snooping all over the place. Angelo, for years, had been secretly meeting his brother, help hiding him for years. He worried that the FBI would want to search records for narcotics and they would want to find the money trail. He also worried that his in-laws, whom he considered fucking rats, and that was based on wiretaps, would run to the FBI. Ruggiero found himself really in a strange spot. On one hand, he was trying to mourn his brother, but on the other, he wanted to protect himself. He wanted to protect his interests, and he fully and ultimately wanted to control his brother's rackets. That's the bottom line. Money, money, money. Days after the news, Angelo ends up scrambling, and he wanted to actually rent a boat, and he wanted to head out towards the wreckage to see if there was any money or drugs floating in the water. Ruggiero ultimately would end up sending Alfred Dallentash, who worked with Salvatore in the narcotics trade, and he would send Gene Gotti and Johnny Carniglia to Sal's house, and he ordered them take everything that you can that could be related to any narcotics, any money, anything, get it the fuck out of the house. Ruggiero would even join them at helping get rid of everything. And basically it was a document grab, and it was a drug search and a money search. Anything that could lead anyone to drugs or money, or anything that could lead Ruggiero back to facilitating his brother's sort of fugitive status, he wanted gone, because Ruggiero knows that the feds and the DEA are going to come in. Now, granted, his brother did not use his name when he flew. He used an alias, but he knew it would only be a matter of fucking time before the FAA found the flight ledgers. Then they were going to have a bigger problem. And so basically what ends up happening is just what I told you. The FAA, the DEA, and the FBI finds out that who the people on the plane actually were, and what do? They get search warrants, and they come into the house, and they don't find anything because Ruggiero had already expected that they were going to do that. So anything that they might have found, he already removed. But it's worth noting that the reason why Salvatore and his wife Stephanie were on the lam was for tax evasion charges and narcotics charges. They pretty much just jumped out of the way and said, fuck this, we're getting out of here. And that was in 1977. And Angelo had a reason to worry, because he had been hiding and help hide his brother and sister-in-law in plain sight. They were living in $1 million house in an upscale neighborhood called Franklin Lakes in New Jersey. So prior to his brother's death, and this is very important because, first of all, the FBI was watching Ruggiero anyway because of his brother, because they figured, well, if anybody knows where Sal is, Angelo's going to fucking know. But there was a whole nother reason. They had already been on top of Angelo Ruggiero. What essentially had happened was, prior, like I said, to his brother's death, former Bonanno boss and soon-to-be informant Joey Massino had taken off, fleeing possible indictment for the three capos' murders. Via wiretaps, the feds knew that Angelo Ruggiero was talking to Massino over the phone after Massino fled the area and was hiding in the Pocono Mountains. They knew it because they had applied for a wiretap the previous year. That wiretap was granted by a federal judge because the feds had suspicions that Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti, and Gene Gotti, and Neil Della Croce not only were involved in narcotics, but in murders, but more specifically, they felt that Gotti, Ruggiero, and Della Croce had some sort of involvement in the three capos' murders, and that they in fact had something to do with the bodies being hidden. So they were the cleanup crew. That's what they had suspected. Gotti, Ruggiero, and others were responsible for the bodies being moved, according to the FBI, and that's why they were watching Ruggiero. But there's even more going on. Bruno Indelicato, which, if you're familiar with Bruno Indelicato, watching Donnie Brasco, you know, he was the son of Anthony Indelicato, and they were going to kill him too, et cetera, et cetera. Well, after his father gets killed, he's hell-bent on killing everybody. And he thought that Neil Della Croce had given the green light for the murder of the three capos, because technically, if you want to look at it, they're killing three captains. This is a family thing. Somebody on the commission has to green light it. Neil Della Croce would have been sort of the messenger for it. He would have been the guy that was on behalf of Castellano to say, go ahead and do it. And that's what Bruno Indelicato thought. And so I understand, you know, him being ferociously pissed off about that. But shortly after the hit on the three capos, John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero were on Cross Bay Boulevard, and they were driving, and Angelo looks in the rear view and he thinks they've got a tail. And so Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti tells Angelo, slow it up. Let's see who they are. The car pulls up right alongside of them, and Bruno Indelicato from the back seat points a gun at Gotti and Ruggiero and starts firing. Ruggiero was able to get them the fuck out of the area, unhurt. With that incident, that pushed John Gotti and Joey Massino to become very, very, very close friends, which is going to play a big part in some stuff that's going to happen down the line here. So the feds were getting solid information. And in fact, the feds had already rented a house across the street from Angelo's. Not only did they have wiretaps, but they had surveillance cameras, and they consistently showed Gene Gotti showing up, John Carniglia showing up, and they were able to hear a lot of things that, let's be honest, they shouldn't have fucking heard. Eventually the traffic stopped, and eventually the wiretap stopped. It went dead, and they thought that Angelo had found the wiretap, but it turns out that he just stopped having people come over, probably because he was nervous and other things. And this led to, ultimately, one day they're watching the house and they see moving vans pull up, and that means Ruggiero's moving from where he lives, and they're going to have to legally shut down the wiretaps and wait until Angelo Ruggiero moves somewhere else to begin listening again. And so we are going to leave it there for this week, because what is very important, and one of the things that is not discussed very often, is a lot of people think, we hear the comments, the tapes, the fucking tapes. These tapes are bigger than anybody ever thought, because I think people largely expect that, or at least reasonably try to assert, that Angelo Ruggiero, for some reason, doesn't really get picked up on wiretaps till way down the line. It's not true. They were on Ruggiero from fucking day one, because the rumors they were hearing on the street and words from people like Willie Boy Johnson, who was a fucking rat, who Tommy Patera shot, 16 fucking times in the head. Willie Boy Johnson was the rat, and he had been informing people where Angelo conducts business, where he talks, who he talks to, what he talks about, and all of that information was being cycled back to the feds. That was enough to get the wiretap. So all of these sort of fictionalized sort of stories about how, well, Angelo just picked up the phone and just starts talking, and the feds were lucky to pick it up. No, the feds were on Angelo Ruggiero from day one because of his brother Sal. And that's the thing. Angelo, even on these wiretaps at multiple times, said, I'm worried about wiretaps. I'm worried about people fucking coming into my house. And at one point, they went into his fucking house. And we're going to talk about that last week. At one point, they go into his house as fucking phone repairmen and place a bug in his phone. He let them in. He let them in. And ultimately, that wiretap is going to lead to another wiretap of Paul Castellano. And so all of these things that we're talking about, all of them, you take Angelo Ruggiero out the fucking equation. If he's not talking from day one, not blabbering, then they don't get any of the narcotics charges, which lead to the commission case. If Roy DeMeo is killed immediately after this bullshit with the Colombians, then he doesn't go on his killing spree. Then the Kuwaiti shit doesn't get Paul Castellano pulled into that. Then Paul Castellano's charged with 20 murders or whatever the fuck because of things that DeMeo did. And so it's a chain of events, A, B, C. Oh, wait, and guess what? If he doesn't align himself with the fucking Westies, he doesn't get charged with those murders either. So everything that we're talking about is a spoke, A, B, C, D, E, F. And all of this leads to a finale of John Gotti killing Paul Castellano. And so for those that think that John Gotti just did this willy-nilly and that I just don't like Paul, fuck him in his ass, I'm going to kill him. There are a whole bunch of other things that are at play here that nobody talks about. It wasn't just a matter of Gotti not liking Castellano. It's not a matter of Gotti doing what he did, which was against the rules by all accounts. But as I always say, he did nothing different than anybody before him. If you're not going to hold Luciano Gambino responsible for that too, then you can't hold John Gotti responsible for it. He did what he thought he had to do. Now we can justify that. But a lot of people, typically when you talk to them about this particular issue or this topic, it's always John Gotti's bravado and John Gotti this and John Gotti thought he was that and this, that, and the third. The truth is, and you've never heard Gravano talk about any of this stuff. And these are factual court documents. This isn't like me making shit up. You've never heard Gravano talk about this. You've never heard it. Paul thought he was a businessman and John thought he was better than the world. None of that's fucking true. None of it's accurate. And I think the one thing that I've always just really worked hard on, I have said it myself. Did John Gotti talk too much? Yes. Should John Gotti have learned to duck? Yes. Was John Gotti capable of so much more? Yes. Was John Gotti a gangster? Yes. Was he the brightest crayon in the box? No. These are all things I say, and people like to cherry pick what I say. But you never hear Gravano talk about the politics. These are politics. These are events. You never hear Gravano say, well, if Paul didn't align himself with the Westies, this probably wouldn't have happened. If Angelo Ruggiero doesn't get caught selling drugs, this probably doesn't happen. And then you have the section of the show that we will get to in the next couple of weeks when Paul Castellano demands those fucking tapes. Paul already had copies of those tapes. And I'm going to tell you something right now. If you listen to my show, I swear to God, this is true. You have a fucking rat informant fuck who is on YouTube right now and other platforms saying things that are not accurate. Well, Paul wanted the tapes and Angelo wouldn't give them up. Motherfucker, it is public fucking knowledge, you fucking rat jerk off fucking tranny loving fuck. Public knowledge. Paul already had copies of the tapes. He knew what Angelo said. Why wouldn't Paul have copies to those tapes? He's going to get indicted. He has to have copies of them tapes because he's being indicted. They give you copies. It's called fucking evidence. Exculpatory evidence, whatever you want to call it. But he was trying to get an advance copy. He wanted to know what Angelo said. So what he could prepare for. But he was already indicted. But he already had those fucking tapes. He knew what Angelo said. That's why he was fucking mad. He was testing Dela Croce's fucking loyalty to him. Are you going to force this prick to give me these tapes, or am I going to have to do something stupid? But by the time that Paul really kind of gets what's going on, he's getting fucked by DeMeo. He's getting fucked by Nino Gaggi. He's really going to take it in the ass when Dominic Montiglio starts to talk. Do I need to keep going here? So the point I'm trying to make is Paul Castellano walks into a fucking thunderstorm, a tornado. And yeah, we give Paul Castellano on the show a lot of grief for being a business guy. But the mistake that Paul Castellano made, and you're going to see it by the time we finish his life, is that he should have started killing motherfuckers immediately. If he did that, he wouldn't have had the problems. And then by proxy, that would have made him super feared. And this wasn't a guy that wasn't afraid to kill somebody. All right. So all that being said, we are going to be back next week with the Gambino Crime Family Part 5. Let me know what you think about the show. Feel free to email the show at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. And we will see everybody next week with a brand